It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the island country of Japan, unleashing the destructive power of 20,000 tons of TNT over a blast radius of 13 square kilometers. 93% of the buildings in the city were damaged in some capacity, and 63% were utterly obliterated. 3 days later, another even more powerful bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, forcing Japan into surrender and closing the curtain on World War II, the bloodiest war that humanity had ever witnessed. The development of atomic weaponry like the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Little Boy, and the plutonium bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Fat Man, was something first researched by the Germans. In January of 1939, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered what we now know today as nuclear fission. And shortly after, Germany began its uranium project. Although this project was overall considered a failure and failed to make significant progress, Albert Einstein was fearful that with more time and funding, the Germans could eventually achieve nuclear capabilities. He voiced these concerns in a series of letters that he sent to President Roosevelt, and as Einstein famously came to regret at a later date, he urged the president to begin funding a nuclear program of his own. 2 years later, in 1941, Roosevelt answered Einstein's concerns, and thus the Manhattan Project was created. The project was highly secretive, to the point where only a choice few individuals knew of its true aim. Instead, various agencies and government bodies were assigned to research and labor over various aspects of the bomb, none of the parties being aware of the overarching purpose of their work. When the research came to a head in 1945, a number of scientists and government officials gathered in a remote corner of New Mexican desert called Jornada del Muerto, Journey of Death. Here, the very first atomic bomb in history was tested and detonated. People present were astounded by its destructive might.
The effects could well be unprecedented, magnificent, beautiful, stupendous, and terrifying. No man-made phenomena of such tremendous power had ever occurred before.
Now we are all sons of bitches.
The director of the test, Dr. Kenneth Bainbridge, famously quoted a passage of the Indian religious text, the Bhagavad Gita, that was called to mind upon witnessing the explosion. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. During the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, President Truman expressed that he would be willing to use this technology against Japan. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay, he said. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Japan had failed to heed this warning, and as a result, Colonel Poltavitz was chosen to drop the first bomb from his B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay. The city of Hiroshima was chosen as a target for its military significance, and on August 6, 1945, the bomb was deployed, incinerating nearly every building within a 1-mile radius and instantaneously killing approximately 70,000 people. High above the ruined city, the co-pilot of the Enola Gay, Robert Lewis, gazed down at the destruction and exclaimed, "My God, what have we done?" 3 days later, Japan had still not issued a surrender, so a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. 40,000 additional civilians were promptly killed, and like Hiroshima, the city was decimated. Faced with such unprecedented levels of destruction, the Japanese emperor had no choice but to yield, for fear that the US could deploy more atomic bombs and his country would be obliterated. The US was understandably joyous that the war they had fought for 6 long years had finally come to an end, but soon the gruesome details of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings began to surface. Victims who weren't immediately annihilated from the blast were often left with horrific injuries and gruesome burns and scars. In addition, in the months to come, the world would soon learn the dangers of radiation poisoning, as tens of thousands of Japanese citizens, many of whom outwardly appearing unscathed, began to fall extremely ill. These people were often prone to various types of cancer or cataracts. Because of the sheer horror brought upon by these bombings, the US was met with a fair deal of controversy. It was said that they used excessive force and broke a rule of war by causing such immense civilian death. Despite this, Truman stood by his decision, stating that, "When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true." It was also argued that if the bombs were not used, the amount of carnage caused in the resulting invasion of mainland Japan would have been even more devastating. Regardless, the bombings signify a turning point in history, not only marking the first and only use of atomic warfare, but also launching the world into the midst of the atomic age, where an entirely new set of threats would engulf the nation.
We helped in creating this new weapon in order to prevent the enemies of mankind from achieving it ahead of us, which, given the mentality of the Nazis, would have meant inconceivable destruction and the enslavement of the rest of the world. We delivered this weapon into the hands of the Americans and the British people as trustees of the whole mankind, as fighters for peace and liberty. But so far, we fail to see any guarantee of peace. We do not see any guarantee of the freedoms that were promised to the nations in the Atlantic Charter. The war is won, but the peace is not.